So as we talk about next gens, I know Fiona's got a few slides, but I want if you could each introduce yourself and answer a two-parter as it relates to next gens, the things that excite and scare you as next gens, and then give a proper introduction.
Hey everyone, Philip Benjamin, single family office out of Seattle. I'll give a little bit of background. I think a few of you may have heard me talk a bit about myself so far, but the first thing I want to say is just, I think it's important when we talk about multi-generational family offices is that, you know, what are your values that you have around that? And I think the strongest statement that I would say is just, I view myself as a custodian, you know, rather than a recipient. And that's a big value in my family. We're a fourth generation real estate family, and that's fairly rare to make it that far, and take a lot of pride in that. I also kind of want to think about and talk a little bit about this idea of, you know, how do you innovate and how do you kind of challenge the way that family offices think about investing, right, and managing their money. And you know, I think when you look at my family, like we did one thing for a long time, we did real estate, right? And when we had an exit in 2008, we had to kind of start over from scratch. And one of the things that we really wanted to do is we wanted to diversify into other asset classes. And so something that I've been working on for the last 15 years is really building out our alternatives and VC and private equity arm. And I was thinking about, how do I do that? And the way we started out was we started making investments in funds, right? Because we didn't know what we were doing. And the next step is we started making direct investments. And then finally, we asked the question, how do we take ourselves from being LPs all the time and then move in eventually into more of a GP position? And one of the things that, that I chose to do was, to actually go ahead and partner with a fund that I had worked with and I had invested with. And so that's been a big innovation for us. And so that took us into the GP position. So I think I've already talked a little bit about that strategy. I don't want to go too deep into it. I'm happy to have people follow up with me more on that if they want to hear more. But, something that I do want to talk a little bit about is this idea of non-zero sum transactions versus zero sum transactions. And, something that I think is a zero sum transaction is the idea of always needing to buy shares of a company versus how do we work with a company or an individual who needs liquidity, and instead of buying their shares from them, we can lend to them. And so that is something that I'll follow up on, but I think for now, I'll pass it down.
Sure. So Richard Nespola, help manage our single family office and then a family holding company. And, G2, I'm an only child of two only children, which makes governance super easy and super complicated. And I like to say, I know way too much about my parents and they know way too much about me, and it's crazy. Yeah. Anyway, so I've been kind of managing our family holding company for the past 8 years. Really very similar kind of mentality, really thinking about kind of, we made our money in telecom, how we made that transition to get more exposure, more impact oriented investing. I've got 3 kids, right? So going from a very small family to a large and diversifying family over time, something I'll be thinking about. But really the legacy kind of shifted from a mentality standpoint of how to have a really positive impact in the world and how we can use not our dollars from a standpoint of impact and philanthropy, but to really do things that were much more beneficial to my kids and the world that they were going to inherit. And the things that I think from a structural and systems change standpoint, we could stand behind as a family and still generate a really good rate of return by the things that we're invested in and supporting, but also too, just a much more collegial approach of how do we partner with other families? How do we find other unique and interesting ideas that we're not responsible for generating, but gravitate our kind of, mentality and our thoughts and our resources to support those things. And we find a lot of that in other families. We find that, the world's bigger than just us, right? And when you start to expand the aperture a bit, you have a lot more surface area to attack that gets super interesting. And we love to be paid to learn. I think learning's like be relentlessly curious, kind of the thing I instill in my kids. Buck convention, look at things in a unique way and try to innovate in areas where other people haven't. And what you typically find is someone else has thought that same way, right? And so a lot of my role and thing as a G2 is like, how do I take what my father built and his success, not just make that our success as a family, but to propagate that to my kids and to instill in them the same values and work ethic and a mentality of exploration, but stewardship, which was your point, not just for ourselves, but for all the people and the things around them as well. Because it's much larger than just one family. It's what's our level of responsibility to everyone else around us too. So.
Weaving on that basket. There we go. She's got a couple slides, I think. So, yeah, Decarbonized is just a way of us explaining how we catalyze inside our family, and other family offices and other NextGens that are taking on a collective global responsibility. So if we can pop to the next, there we go. So we've really gone into conservation, fishing, ocean, and forests. So for example, here, this is a women's nursery that's housing 2,400 of a very specific series of trees that are some of the most rarest trees. And I'm not going to tell you where they are or where it is, which country it's in, because it's also about plant protection and empowering others. And so our kids are very much involved in collaboration of this, but most of these women came out of human trafficking, or in certain areas, they needed a form of education, and they are teaching us what is the most important things on the earth. And so I would say it's the opposite. We need to learn from them. So if we go forwards. Yeah. So again, we frame it around the SDG goals, environmental, social governance, and as we go forwards there. So a lot of the area in decarbonization as we look at conservation and restoration and the zero carbon energy. So one area that I invested in the last few years is decarbonizing shipping, and the other area is in regenerating forests. Both of those are long haul investments, and they're not just philanthropy. It has to wrap blended finance. And then in the blue revolution, that one part of the technology company that is decarbonizing shipping is actually hits two buckets in our family philosophy, which is also in innovating technology that can make changes into oceans. So that technology wraps not only hydrolaminar flow bubbles across ships to reduce 5 to 15% of the fuel use of the ships around the world, but it also reduces the sounds and the sonic interruption that is killing the whales in the ocean. So I think it's, something interesting that my kids have been very much involved in their expansion and their quest in investing into things that are innovative and scientific, and then taking along other children. I mean, I'm also an educator. Anybody knows Steiner or Waldorf School? So it's all about a collaborative community infrastructure. We've got biodynamic gardening. We've got the actions towards empowering education, and then also sharing lessons, life lessons. There we go. And so under that is the aquaculture side of it, and then finishing ocean conservation, environmental laws, and financing environmental lawyers around the world. So that's been part of our side to it too.
So you mentioned lessons. What's a mistake from a next gen oriented challenge or mistake that you've made that you think we could all learn from?
Excellent. I'll just say the one that I have, if you go 1, 2 forwards, there we go.
I got it.
It was just, I'm dyslexic, so it's much easier if you go forwards quick. There we go. So money on mobile. I am collaboratively co-invested in the smallest loan portfolio in India for advancing $5 to $15 loans for women in India. And you end up having technology that is good and bad, because in Bihar state, which is one of the poorest states in India, we actually raised the price of the dowry for people to sell their daughters. So once you empowered change makers, you also have that negative side of technology and learning from those lessons.
But in a next gen sense, maybe you'll hear how they answer it, and
Yeah,
then you'll have
okay.
your.
I get it, but,
Biggest mistake. Never assume that the check is written for the things you want to do without clearing it with your family. I think like alignment of interests and really clear communication is really important, right? That's in everything you do, but when you have a passion for a certain area, it doesn't necessarily sync with the passion of the older generation. They're not necessarily in sync, or don't see it as well. So I think, over communicating is probably one of the best things. And, it's, I would say that's probably the most important part. And I'll instill that lesson to my kids too, just FYI. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was, again, it came back down to realizing that we had to diversify, right? We had to diversify out of one asset class, and that also that we weren't immediately able to do that. That's, you can't just assume that, oh, you can become a jack of all trades immediately. And I actually don't think any family office can do that ever, unless you're so big that you can hire, the people in to be experts in a given industry. And so I think what you need to do is you need to know what you're good at, and you need to specialize, and then you need to outsource the rest. And I think that is a mistake that many family offices do, is either they do too few things or they try to do too many things themselves.
I don't have too many more mistakes, Mark. Sorry. That's the one major one. No, look, I'd also say too, like, you're a G4, I'm in the middle of my kind of journey here. I think there's an undervalued or underappreciated aspect of just pressure, right? You got a wealth creator, you have wealth stewardship, you have a family name, you have things you stand for. There are a lot of things that you hold on to dearly, right? And kind of celebration with the family. And I think having a great sense of legacy, like Mitzi Purdue has talked about this forever, about creating a really great transitional standpoint of understanding where the family made its wealth and how that's transitioned, and how much hard work and effort went into that. Super important to have that kind of relatable transition and never take that for granted. But the other side of the coin too, it's a lot of pressure, right? So, my father's always had kind of an understanding, like, and there's another great person, unfortunately I forgot his name, but, he asked the question of like, what's the wealth for? That's the most important question to ask. And for my father was like, I created this wealth so, multiple generations of our family could pursue their dreams and the things without ever kind of thinking about make a sacrifice or trade for money, right? So if my granddaughter would become an artist or wanted to pursue something in ecological studies, she could do that without ever having to worry about it. So it was really a way of pursuing passion, right? And so when you start to think of it that way, that's also a lot of pressure too, right? There are sacrifices and trades to be made because you come from a family that's done really well in a certain area, and they find out you're not in the family business, and they go, why is that? So they're just like, I think you have a lot of untold stories or narratives that it really forces a different conversation, which is why safe spaces with other families are really important to share those experiences, right? And so, like, there are other, like Nexus has been great, and there are like lots of other like kind of multi-generational family oriented organizations that are really helpful in that regard. But also too, like everyone in this room has a different experience and a different level of what they've gone through. So I think that's another aspect too, like, just because we're in it doesn't mean we're in it, right? And there are people who make conscious decisions not to be a part of the family because it's healthier for them too, right? So I think there's just a lot that goes into it. Like, the old saying, like, one family is not the same, is totally true, right? So anyway, I just add that.
Any other comments or questions before we move on to the breakouts listed? Oh, sorry, Joe. Oh, and Mike.
Yeah, more of a comment about, I had a relationship with the DuPont family, which is the oldest money in this country. And if you read the history of the DuPonts, a great playbook on how to manage multi-generational wealth and family businesses. What expectations do you want to place on each generation?
Still giving them the full latitude to choose their own path, but setting an expectation and a path to enter the family business literally from the bottom up. I mean, it's a wonderful playbook, and it's literally, there's plenty of history on it. They were they're old French money, if you know the history. And so they were, typical European wealth is quieter than American wealth. And they came here quiet. So they didn't really want to share this. their strategy. I mean, Pierre DuPont wrote the first book on how to run a corporation, and yet they've kept it so discreet. So there's a great lessons to be learned because that money has stayed through 200 years in this country and kept a very productive. And actually the quick conclusion to the story is when DuPont started failing in the 60s, it's because it was the first time a non-DuPont was running it. A guy named Greenwald, who was married to one of the DuPont daughters, but he wasn't blood. And that was the beginning of the end of DuPont Corporation itself, actually. Now it just got rolled into Dow. So anyway, study DuPonts if you really want great lessons.
Yeah, I would somewhat, I mean, I know Pierre and he's a wonderful, wonderful spirit, but I do believe that the next generations have a vast more understanding about what's critical for them. And that's, I'm listening. I have had to, because it's not just within our realm, but within many, many families. I mean, being part of, for example, a family office friend in Colombia, she's like, well, how do I stay out of getting killed, Fiona? And that how do I invest to make sure that I follow my family and my values, but do it discreetly. And so I think that there's a lot with technology coming on. There's also a challenge of how do you actually have a choice where you want to invest. I mean, for example, she's like been buying up stuff here in America, but it puts her at risk. And then the opposite, I put at risk buying forests and supporting indigenous communities by giving them loans. And I put those women at risk as well. So I come back to every one of us in this room is actually an investor. And every one of us has our own family. And come back to what is your ethics? What empowers you? What is the choices you want to make impact? And frankly, I mean, I've been working with my kids and other young generations. They were investing at age 4, age 12. They chose where they wanted to go because I don't think that their financial advisors are supposed to make those decisions. But that's me. And that's where some of us I've also helped a lot of families break their trusts. Like that's an old model. Those next gens, where are they going with their money? What do they want to do? So I'm always a resource and open to empower and inspire. Thanks.
Want to share two things. So first thing is, so for my family, my great grandfather came and did textiles, started buying some real estate. My grandfather and his two brothers built the company up. And then by the time there was a third generation, there were 16 cooks in the kitchen trying to run a real estate company, and they didn't all get along, and it was failing. And the key to that success was bringing in outside management and getting ourselves out of the way and onto a board. And that's what we were able to do in that third generation, thanks to my father and his cousins who realized that dynamic wasn't healthy, such that then in a fourth generation, we were able to have a big liquidity event, right? And start over. And so that brings me to this metaphor that I talk to sometimes, which it's a farming metaphor. I'm not a farmer. But, what do you do first? You plant seeds, then you grow the crop, then you harvest the crop. And then what do you have to do after you harvest? You have to plant new seeds, right? And so I think there's a life cycle to a business that is owned by a family. And I don't know how many generations it can last for, but at a certain point, you either need to have it become more of a corporation where you get out of your way and the family politics are no longer an issue, or you need to sell it and start over and allow everybody to kind of plant new seeds. And so, that's something that I think my family realized at G4. So in a sense, I'm a G1, G2, if you look at it from a starting over standpoint like that.
So you may have noticed I have a glass of wine in my hand.
I did notice, Mark.
Yes. So, right. So we have these breakouts, and I thought as we seek ways to collaborate, it might be helpful if you're so inclined to visit this part of the room before you go to the other parts of the room. We'll gather one more time afterwards. As you go around the room, as you go around your breakout rooms, again, same concept, introductions, just figure out how we can collaborate, create events, share knowledge initiatives like Robinhood does. And we haven't done a NextGen event solely on NextGens for a while, but I always find it really interesting because it's usually some of the innovative thinking is, it needs stewarded, but it comes out of people like you guys. So with that all that in mind, just there's wine, water, or whatever. Last set of breakouts.
Come join our 361 firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.